Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the various tools that we can use to measure built environment and the use of built environment by people who practice active transportation. So first we're going to talk about why measurement is important, and then we're going to talk about the various things that we can measure, and then finally how it is that we do it. So when we look at an environment that supports active transportation, it tends to be pretty obvious what we're looking for, right? So just some visual examples. We've got some before and after here. Top picture, not very supportive of active transportation. After some renovation, bottom picture, same intersection, much better, right? We've got just a really different approach here to how people are moving through these streets. Over here on the left, we've got a before and after. We've got a street that's undergone some renovation, hoping to increase use of active transportation. And then here we've got another example of some improvements. So it's easy to look at the after pictures for each of these and identify this as an environment where active transportation is more supported by the built environment characteristics, right? But for research purposes, we can't go with what our gut tells us, right? We need to be able to collect data, and we need to be able to support the reasons why we've chosen the elements that we have. So there's always the need to find some way to quantify what we're looking at in order to be able to analyze it. But just also in general, kind of this rule of management, right? If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, Whether you're trying to add sidewalks or produce widgets, unless you have some numbers around your process, you really can't manage it. And I'm going to go a step further with that if you can't automate the measurement of it in this environment, then it's going to be really difficult to improve it. And we'll talk about why as we talk about some of the ways that we collect data here in the field. So when we look at the ways that we collect data, there's a couple of different categories. We have perceived environment measures, observational measures, and GIS tools. And then we got ways to compare those measurements to physical activity levels. So starting with those perceived environment measures, these are kind of the fastest and easiest to collect, right? We're going to talk to people who live or work or travel through the area, and we're going to ask them what they think of the environment. How does it feel? Does it feel safe? Does it feel pleasant? Do they feel unsafe when they're walking through the area? Typically, when we do this kind of research, we find that as perceptions of the environment are more positive, and its support for active transportation, then people are more likely to be active in the area, right? So we've got these. How do you feel about your environment? What do you do in your environment? When you put those two together, feeling good about the perceived safety or support of your environment leads to greater rates of active transportation. But there's also a kind of just a bit of a confounder here. If you are somebody who typically moves through a neighborhood by car and you see some nice broad sidewalks, you might say, yes, this neighborhood is a great place for people to walk. But it may be that when somebody's actually out there on the sidewalk, but they can see things a little more clear than you, like maybe the crossings are really wide, right? And it just doesn't feel safe for you to be out there trying to cross 5 or 6 lanes as a pedestrian with cars going by at high rates of speed. Or maybe the sidewalk needs repair, right? So sometimes the people who use the area the most have a different perception than people who don't. And of course, anytime that we're measuring perceptions, again, it's a little harder to quantify, right? We can't count the number of intersections or tabulate the number of miles, right? We're asking people how they feel, which is important, but it's also hard to change. We can't go in and add a sidewalk and then tell people to change the way they feel about it, right? So it can be difficult to modify. We've also got observational measures. So this is a category where we have a tool like we use for data collection in this class, where the researchers go out to the actual physical environment and then do the data collection. And then finally, we have a newer category of tools, and these are geographic information systems, or GIS tools. So these are usually faster, easier, and cheaper than the above measures, but they're only as good as the existing data set, right? If you've ever gotten stuck trying to use Google Maps or Google Earth for directions, and you find that the intersection looks a little bit different when you get there, routes are open, routes are closed, that kind of thing, you know how this works. So none of these are perfect, but they all have different strengths and weaknesses. And then once we've collected data through one of these measures, then typically we compare it to some kind of measure of physical activity. Classic at the beginning was we'd send out a survey, we'd ask people how they feel about their neighborhood, And then we'd ask them how much physical activity they engage in on a regular basis, right? So we've got self-reported perceived environment measures, and then self-reported physical activity levels. And then another that we can do this is we can actually use instruments like pedometers or accelerometers or counters out in an environment to see how many people are passing. So when we look at the things that we measure, they tend to fall in a couple of separate categories. So if we're trying to characterize the differences between the walking environment on the left and the one on the right, what are some things that we could measure? Some of them fall into the domain of functionality. What is the walking surface like? Is it smooth? Is it paved? Is it rocky? Is it in poor repair? Maybe permeability. This is a term that you probably ran into in your built environment class, where we talk about access to other neighborhoods or to businesses. So ways that the built environment actually functions. There are other items that fall into the domain of safety. How do people feel about their safety from traffic as they're in the area? And then also their personal safety, which kind of measures the safety from crime as well. Then we've got some aesthetic characteristics. We can see those really clearly between the environment on the left and the environment on the right. So how do we measure that? Sometimes we count trees, sometimes we estimate the amount of green space. Sometimes we even talk about the view that's available in an environment like that. And then finally, destinations. What kinds of facilities are nearby? Because that can help us also to determine how walkable an environment is. So let's talk a little bit more about those perceived environment scales in a little bit more detail. This is one of the most well-established parts of the field because it was one of the first ones that we started measuring. So this part's a couple of decades old. Here we see hundreds of published studies, and we found in general positive associations between self-reported walkability, right? So if people perceive that their local environment is walkable, then they also tend to report the presence of recreation facilities like parks, presence of sidewalks, presence of shops, so destinations, and then also that traffic is not a threat to safety. So in general, when we look back at the works that's been done in this area, this is what we see. Typically, the way this data is collected, it can be done through interviewers, where somebody calls, or you meet people at a local rec center or park and try to collect data that way. Sometimes they're also self-administered. They may be surveys that are distributed at a meeting. They may arrive by mail or email. And then there's also a module that's available with the BRFIS that collects some information on these measures as well. Some of the popular tools in this area, one of the oldest is the Neighborhood Environment Walkability Scale, or NEWS. This one has 70 items, right? 68. So if you get asked to fill out this survey, it's going to be a couple of pages and you're going to wonder whether or not you really want to do this, right? So we're looking for ways to collect information of similar quality with a lower investment of time. And that's what the abbreviated NEWS came out a couple of years later and cut out about 15 items that didn't seem to be as valuable as some of the other ones. A more recent one, the NPAC, the Neighborhood Physical Activity Questionnaire, this one's down to just 32 items, right? So we're trying to get quality information at the lowest cost to the people who are responding to our surveys. And several of these have a subset for kids because their responses and their questions are going to be slightly different. The ways that these questions might be asked, it's pretty typical here that these are Likert scales, and the responses would be something like extremely to not at all. So the question would be, do you think your neighborhood is safe from crime? And the answer would be, yes, I think it's extremely safe. Maybe I think it's quite safe, or not at all safe, right? So you're answering along that scale. And you're answering questions like, do you feel safe from traffic? Do you think walking in your neighborhood is pleasant? So these are the kinds of questions that are asked when we collect data on a perceived environment scale. So any kind of data collection involves some trade-offs, right? It's never perfect, unfortunately. We know that longer questionnaires, and this isn't specific to perceived environment, but to really kind of any survey work, longer questionnaires tend to be more accurate, but people are less likely to complete them. They measure perceptions accurately, but then how do we change or improve perceptions, right? How do we, if somebody says, I feel like my neighborhood is not safe to walk in, how do we change that feeling? We can include, we can increase lighting, we can, if it's traffic safety, we can add barriers between pedestrians and cars. But how do we change a feeling, and how do we know what's going to do that? It's not quite as clear. And then one more thing that we see with perceived environment is that it can be affected by high-profile incidents, even if those are not normal. There's actually a really classic case of this in active transportation to school, where a county in California invested millions of dollars in pedestrian improvements near schools. It was a whole county-wide effort to try to increase active transportation to school rates. And then, very sadly, there was a very high-profile kidnapping of a child who ended up murdered. And it really changed some perceptions among parents about the safety of allowing their children to walk to school. So even though the improvements were great, the perception of safety in the area decreased, even though those infrastructure improvements were added. So it's not perfect. It's also tends to be cheaper than some of our other options. So just some pros and cons there if we decide to do this work this way. Another route that we can take is observational measures. And this is where a person actually appears in the environment and starts collecting data. This is sometimes done by a research team, and then in other circumstances, it can be done through kind of a crowdsourcing approach where we ask people in the community to participate in this as well. And what this is going to involve is some kind of systematic observation, right? We're going to ask people to count, to measure, to estimate various characteristics of the environment. And it could be particularly things these days that are particularly hard to do with geographic information systems, like the presence and size of trees or the width of the sidewalk, right? Things that are a little more difficult to do using an electronic tool. The general strategy here is that the environment is broken down into segments. It could be 1/10 of a mile or 1/4 mile, and then sampled. We're not going to do every street in the area. We're going to do, one segment on randomly selected streets, and then put that data together and draw some conclusions. And then it's not always streets and street segments. Sometimes these are used actually for parks and trails as well. So some of the tools that we've seen develop in this area, one of the earliest was this SPACES tool, Systematic Pedestrian and Cycling Environment Scan. Again, talking about the number of items, this one was about 50 items per segment, and it took about 40 minutes to complete. So this is a thorough but time-consuming. Again, we see that development where we try to get the tool pared down to the most important questions, down to about 36 questions for PEDS, the Pedestrian Environment Data Scan, which is about 5 years newer. And this one is down to about 3 to 5 minutes. So we can see the toll that it takes, the burden on data collectors getting less and less. Some other new tools, the MAPS, or the Microscale Audit of Pedestrian Streetscapes, is a newer tool. This one has a couple of different versions. The full version, 120 items, typically only used in research settings. The abbreviated one used in research, and then also among practitioners who are a little bit more connected to research and data collection. And then there's the mini version, which is only 15 items. And that's kind of made available for broader audiences, not quite as much research value there. If you'd like to take a look at either of those more specifically, I've got links here that you can use to access both of those tools. And they'd both be good ones to know about if you ever need to do this kind of data collection in a professional setting. So the trade-offs here, these tend to be much more accurate because we're actually assessing, the quality of the sidewalk rather than asking people what they think the quality of the sidewalk is. But they're also time-consuming, right? We talked already about the amount of time that it takes to collect this data for each street segment. And then they also require training. We want all of the data collectors involved in the project to be drawing the same conclusions. And then we've got this kind of disconnect between perception and objective measurement. We're trying to quantify the look and feel of a place, right? Why is a trail a nicer place to walk than a sidewalk? Why is a pleasantly landscaped sidewalk nicer to walk in than, a concrete jungle? So we're trying to quantify perception, which sometimes can be a little challenging. Now, the good news, of course, is once we've measured this, then we can change things, right? If we know the sidewalks have a lot of damage and are only 4 feet wide, we could go back and we could repair them and make them 6 feet wide. That's a measurable change. But again, since we're sampling and we're not collecting data on every segment in an area, we could miss some important things that are important in particular parts of the environment. Okay, so our third category here, GIS measures, and these are those electronic tools. One of the most common ones is ArcGIS, and it's one that you'll often see cited in journal articles and that sort of thing. Here, we're collecting measures of the built environment, but they're derived from existing data sources. These are commonly provided by, say, local or county government. If they're issuing permits or if they're tracking the presence of sidewalks, because they're the ones who are responsible for repairing them, then they'll make those data sets available for wider use. It is the only realistic way that we can study multiple large areas. We could say, as a class, go out and collect data on the pedestrian environment around UNLV's campus, but it's a small area in a large city. If we want to have any hope of being able to do this on a larger scale, then we'd have to find a way to use electronic tools, right, just to make sure this was an achievable project. Something that we're seeing emerge increasingly is the use of algorithms instead of human analysis. So if you're recording video of an intersection, trying to count the number of cars turning right on red while there are pedestrians in the intersection, you could hire someone to sit there in front of it, or you could develop an algorithm that would allow you to detect that. This is far beyond my skill set, but I know we have some colleagues over in the computer science department who are working on these sorts of things. So we see that the cost burden of collecting data decreasing because it's being done electronically. So here's a sample of how that might work. You'd use your GIS tool, ArcGIS or a similar product, and you would add in these layers to your map, right? So you start with a map and you add in things like population density, land use mix. You could get that maybe from permitting or licensing element of local government. You could add in street speeds. Probably your local RTC has a map of those that might be available. You could add that in. Vehicle traffic volume. This might be something that your local RTC is also tracking. You could add in maybe crime reports, right, from police databases, maybe some measures of greenness or vegetation. All of these depend on someone having collected that data and made it available as an electronic data set. Once that's done, then you would say collect information on active transportation use. Maybe you could send out a survey by mail or email to people who live in a particular area, ask them where they live exactly so that you could track that with geolocation. And then you could ask them what their physical activity habits are like. Maybe you could even pair that with something like pedometer or accelerometer-based data collection. You could also collect information on the built environment features, and then you could do observation of active transportation habits in an area, right? You could have researchers doing bicycle and pedestrian counts on corners. And then once you have collected both of those kinds of data, then you would look for relationships. Are people more likely to walk in areas where the sidewalks are in better repair? Are people more likely to ride their bikes where there are protected bike lanes? And then another thing that we can sometimes see from this is because we can collect so many points of data, is that those are combined into some kind of index that measures support for active transportation. So, of course, this one also comes with trade-offs, right? This is really our only effective way to study large areas, but it's only as good as the data that you start with. An example of this that we talked about, that was on the previous slide, is greenness or vegetation. Who's collecting data on the size of trees? It does happen every once in a while. Does it happen every year, every 6 months? And if your data is 5 years old, are the trees gone? Have they grown? Have they died? Have they been, hit during a motor vehicle crash and they're not there anymore? So you can go ahead and draw your conclusions, but those are only as solid as the data that you started working from. These do definitely still require training, but just a different kind of training. So before we were training people to go out and measure specific environments. Now we're training people on how to use GIS. Of course, if someone hasn't put the data together for the question that we want to ask, then you can't add in that layer, and it makes it more difficult to draw those conclusions. And we may see that we're kind of at the extreme example where we're collecting tons of data in very little time, but that data may not be as accurate, as complete, or as specific as we want. One way that researchers are compensating for this is this idea called ground truthing, where if you collect, say, tens of thousands of points of data, you do also send a researcher out to a particular area to make sure, so say a subset of the samples segments that you collected, you go out to a subset of those and you send a real person there to make sure that the data set that you were using accurately reflects the current conditions. So where do things stand currently? Basically, I believe the field is still looking for an ideal instrument and approach. The ideal characteristics would be that it's fast, accurate, and able to be automated. If you think about trying to do this work over large geographic areas or in multiple geographic areas, the cost and time to try to get people out to each of these areas is really exorbitant. So we need to find ways to do it more automatically. Probably, I would say the ideal research approach here is some elements of each category, right? We need to know what people think about where they are. We also need to know what objective measurement of those characteristics looks like. And then we probably also want to be able to assess those quickly and easily through electronic means with some kind of human verification before we start drawing too many conclusions. One of the ones that's seeing a lot of use right now is the MAPS Mini. This is that 15-item one that is based on that larger scale, longer and more detailed one, that preceded it. Many of these tools were actually developed by an organization called Active Living Research. So this is one of the first institutes that took a leadership role in this kind of research, looking at things like measuring built environment and supporting walkability in those environments. It's based in San Francisco at UCSD, and it's an excellent source of data and tools and research for active transportation and community-based physical activity. If you find yourself maybe in the next year or two out there as a public health professional looking for an infographic on, why public spaces for physical activity are important, you could definitely find something at Active Living Research that's been already been developed. And they have really high quality tools available as well. All right, so we spent today talking about measuring built environment. As with many questions in research and in public health, the more detail the more you drill down, the more complicated it gets, right? The silly thing is that when we see it, we definitely know what it is, right? Our very complicated human brains can look at two pictures and definitely say which one is better for walking or biking, but we have to find a way to measure that if we're going to be working with it in a research setting and to consistently measure it so that we know whether our improvements are working. We talked about perception scales that measure how people feel about their environments, really important, but at the same time difficult to modify. And then we also talked about objective measures, where we get people out into an environment and manually collect data about that environment. And then GIS, which is the technology-based approach, which is pretty similar. And then we talked about kind of what new approaches and tools could look like. Overall, this is an area of the field that continues to develop. I don't think that we have the perfect tool available yet. And although we're standardizing on some, it's definitely not one where there's like a single right answer for researchers in the field. Thanks for your time today. Please let me know with any questions, and I look forward to seeing you for our next lecture.